Continuing from the last class, the swollen bottom part of the ovary, so the middle elongated part is the style and the terminal part which is a sticky is called as the stigma. The ovary contains ovules and each ovule has an egg cell. So you can see in the bottom part the ovary is the bulged part over there. Okay, in the diagram, germination of the pollen on stigma. So in the ovary you have ovules. Each ovule has an egg cell over there. So now talking about the male germ cell. Male germ cell produced by the pollen grain fuses with the female germ cell. So male germ cell is the pollen grain. In the pollen grain you see the male germ cell. So you can see it has fallen on the stigma. From the stigma, the pollen grain is producing a protrusion which is moving towards the ovary and finally it meets the female germ cell. So, reading the text, the male germ cell produced by pollen grain fuses with the female gamete present in the ovule. So, this fusion of the germ cells or fertilization gives us the zygote. So, the male germ cell and the female germ cell, when they meet together, when they fuse together, so this process is called as fertilization. So, the end product after fertilization is called as the zygote. So, zygote which is capable of growing into a new plant. Thus, the pollen needs to be transferred from the stamen to the stigma. So this happens during the pollination process. If this transfer of pollen occurs in the same flower, it is then referred to as self-pollination. I told you yesterday. In a plant, in a hibiscus plant for example, in the same flower, the pollen grains move from there to its own stigma. So then it is called as the self-pollination. So you can't tell if it happens on a rose. If the pollen grain of an hibiscus plant falls on a rose stigma, so then pollination can't happen. So it should be of the same species. On the other hand, if the pollen is transferred from one of the flower to another, its own species, so then it is known as the cross pollination from plant A to plant B. So then it is called as cross pollination, or it could be of the same plant A, the different flower. So this transfer of pollen from one flower to another is achieved by agents like wind, water or animals. After the pollen lands on a suitable stigma, so it has to reach the female germ cell which are in the ovary. So for this, a tube grows out of the pollen grain and travels through the style to reach the ovary. So as I told you earlier, you can see in the diagram the pollen grain. So the male germ cell is moving down towards making a pollen tube. It's reaching to the female germ cell in the ovary. After fertilization, the zygote divides several times to form an embryo within the ovule. So after fertilization, after the fusion of male and female gamete, so the formation of zygote takes place. So this zygote, what happens to the zygote? It divides several times. It keeps on dividing itself to form an embryo within the ovule. So the next formation after zygote is called as what? Embryo. The ovule develops a tough coat and is gradually converted into a seed. The ovule further develops into a seed. The ovary grows rapidly and ripens to form a fruit. So what happens to the ovary? The ovary is the part which forms further as a fruit. So whatever fruit we eat the ovary. What are the seeds what we see? That is the ovule over there. So meanwhile, the petals, sepals, stamen, style and stigma may shrivel and fall off. Means they dry out and fall off from the flower. Have you ever observed any flower part still persisting in the fruit? No. So try and work out the advantages of seed formation for the plant. The seed contains the future plant or the embryo which develops into a seedling under appropriate condition. So this is known as the germination. The future plant which develops from the embryo. Okay, so the seed formation, then the seed actually sprouts out and it starts developing into a new plant. So this process is called as the germination. So we saw pollination. From pollination there is a pollen tube formation, then the fusion of male and female gametes. So this process is called as fertilization. So in higher